So much for coming to our third incarnation of Stories of the Saints. It is no coincidence that there's so much talk of prophetic Christianity at All Saints these days. How many of y'all went to any of the Holy Week speaker series? A good number. The Reverend Natasha Reed Rice, Associate Pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church, spoke of prophetic Christianity here during Holy Week, as did the other two speakers. And all of them referred to the Old Testament scholar, whose name I am probably not going to pronounce correctly, Walter Brueggemann? Yeah. Did I say it right? Oh, good. Look, I'm new to this content. Here is his definition of prophetic Christianity. The task of prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us. Prophetic ministry seeks to penetrate despair so that new futures can be believed in and embraced by us. A time when according to Revelations 21:3, God will be with us and be our God. Prophets don't conjure new realities, rather they call us back to reality itself. And this reality of God's kingdom is a place of economic, racial, gender, orientational, and national justice. We aren't supposed to, as followers of Christ, just seek our own salvation. We are supposed to challenge the existing structures of power in order for God's desire for people to live equitably in love. But if you start speaking in the way that we're called to in prophetic Christianity, what costs of fear, shame, embarrassment, exclusion, and despair may be incurred? What shall buoy us and strengthen us to stay on God's path? Sister Joan Chittister, a Benedictine nun and prophetic Christian, says in her book, The Time Is Now, that the most important balm, consolation, and strength for the followers of prophetic Christianity is to remember those who have come in the past and remain steadfast in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. This is the gift that Mr. Carl Walker, the author of Soulful Bobcats, Experiences of African American Students at Ohio University from 1950 to 1960, and All Saints parishioner for 28 years, offers us. We, as readers and listeners, tend to connect best to the stories of the individual, the personal. Mr. Walker gives us the incredibly important gift of history by letting us see the past through his eyes, his experience. As we come to have a view into his life, we are blessed to receive a view of the lives of many, along with the work of prophetic Christianity that has been done, and that which we are called in this moment today, tomorrow, and each day to do. It has been a true honor and an unforgettable experience to have the blessing to work with Mr. Walker with his story, and I am pleased to introduce him now.
Thank you, Louise. I am truly honored to be here with all of my friends here today, and I need not ask you to forgive me in advance. I'll do that later after the talk. But I do request one thing. Please do not sleep and snore while I talk. Thank you. I would also like to point out that I'm blessed to have my wife, Frances, whom many of you know, here with me, and her nephew, Brett. Frances and I celebrated our 60th wedding anniversary last July with a giant magnum of champagne at the restaurant next door to our, at Houston's restaurant. But life goes on, and it's beautiful, and we've been so blessed with so many things. But first I want to start telling you, put you at a point in time which we can sort of see where we're going here. On January the 1st, 1948, my family was in very deep mourning over the loss of my father about 3 weeks earlier. My father was a coal miner in West Virginia. which is the site of the place of my birth some years earlier. And he was a very hard-working and dedicated family man. He was a gentleman who had had all the fingers on his left hand had been cut off. Each arm had been broken at least once. A leg had been broken, and he was burned from his torso, from his waist up to the bottom of his neck in coal mining accident. So one of the strongest feelings that he expressed was he never wanted to hear of any of his sons working in a coal mine. That was rule one from my father. My mother was a wonderful and compassionate woman. She and her mother, my grandmother, were among the most compassionate people I've ever known. And she truly taught all of us the value of love and the real value and meaning of finding some good in everyone. She was a wonderful mother, very real disciplinarian, and she was called to manage a household a household of 5 boys and 1 girl. There were really 9 children born to my parents. 3 died in infancy, so there was that sort of tragedy that began in their lives. They both migrated from Virginia in about 1916, and they were married in 1922. And as I mentioned, from that union, there were 9 children. Now, my mother's father and one of her brothers had also migrated from Virginia to West Virginia around the same time, and they too were coal miners. They were both killed in the coal mines. So there again, from both sides of the family, I see this present signal of the dangers of going in the mine. Now, my dad need not worry about me. I've gone to the entrance of a coal mine and looked into those dark holes. I know I don't belong there. So that was never a question. But that was a very strong desire on his part that none of us ever go in the coal mine. Although, after his death, one of my older brothers did attempt to go in the coal mine. In those days, in order to go become a miner, you had to go in with an experienced miner, sort of an apprenticeship scene. And the miner would work with you for 3 or 4 days and get you acquainted to the rules of the game. And as my brother approached 4 or 5 of my dad's friends, they all refused to take him in because they knew how strongly my dad felt about that. But at any rate, my dad also, I want to mention, was a veteran of World War I, and he served in France. And you know, in later years, I began to realize that, boy, that's kind of strange that a coal miner with an approximate 5th grade education is teaching his boys how to say bonjour, mademoiselle, comment allez-vous, you know. So I said, wow, this is an unusual educational experience, but it did happen. And it took me several years to figure out that, well, I think he was a real soldier there, not standing on the corners in Paris saying bonjour, mademoiselle. So, he was a great man, as I mentioned, and truly was the model for my own upbringing and value system, as well as that from my mother. So following his death, before his death, I was very active in high school in an organization called the New Farmers of America. Now, some of you may well have heard of the Future Farmers of America, but the Future Farmers of America was an all-white high school organization. The New Farmers of America was the African-American version of this same outfit. My high school, when I was in my first year, they initiated a class in agriculture. And strangely enough, my second role model emerged out of that, the teacher of this agriculture bit. Now, I don't want to confuse you into believing that I became an expert in agriculture, for I wouldn't know the difference between a bull and a heifer at this point. But this man was known in terms of developing young men. And he was very strict, he was very hard, but he was very compassionate and had a great deal of foresight. He was often called to be judges and work with the future farmers of America across racial lines. So it occurred to me later in life that this gentleman had employed the criteria of excellence in achievement in his dealing with the future farmers of America. And so that bar was set for us as African American students, that this is where I want you to be. And one of the things that he truly gave us on a regular basis was a lesson in both academic achievement and race. He told us very clearly that you're not going to be competing with each other, you're going to be competing with white boys in your life. Now that really set a pattern of thinking, I know for me, and as we developed on in our classwork, and I often have memories of his talking and his way of expressing both disappointment and joy, but it was all quite reaffirming in the development of a young man. Now, as a result of being active in the New Farmers of America, I did win both state, regional, and one national competition. On one of those instances where I won a region, which the region I think consisted of Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky, in that competition I won, and when I returned home, it was late in the evening, and my dad was sitting on the front porch. So that was unusual because he usually worked at night on the night shift. So at that time, normally he would still be asleep. But he was sitting up waiting for me. And I remember so well how proud he was. And he told me then, he said, "I want to send you to college." So I said, "Wow, thanks, Dad." But I was frightened at the concept because I didn't know any relative who had been to college. So sure enough, 4 months later, back to that January 1st, 48, 4 months later he passed away. One of my two older brothers said, "Don't worry, Carl, I will send you to college." So I said, okay. But now this is in my senior year of high school. And within 4 months, he was killed in a car accident. So at that point, at age 17, I finished high school and immediately knew that I had been introduced to the world of manhood and responsibility because I had to go to work to help support this large family. Now, my family was always very close. We were a very close-knit family, particularly on my mother's side. Many of you have probably heard the story of Harriet Tubman, who was a slave woman who made several trips into the South and would bring slaves out of the South to the northern states. She carried a number of them to freedom. Well, interestingly enough, I have a Harriet Tubman in my family. My mother's sister, my aunt, and her brother, the two of them left West Virginia in the 1930s, migrated to New York. And as they migrated to New York and settled there, they devised a plan where each of their nephews and nieces, upon completion of high school, could go to New York and live with them until they get a job and get an apartment and make room for another. They liberated 15 of us from West Virginia to New York. So at age 17, I went to New York from West Virginia. And this same uncle, was the second of my heroes. The high school teacher was really the third in rank. But this uncle was quite a man. He was a very handsome man, quite well liked, and he set very early the stage for my own career ambitions. I didn't know what kind of work he did, but I was so impressed that he always went to work with a shirt and a tie on. And I saw that. And all the pictures I ever saw of him were in an office setting, mixed race, and here he is in a shirt and tie. And I said, that's what I want to be. I want to be that guy. Never thought for a chance that there are different kinds of office work. That you might carry water, you might do anything. But he went to work in a shirt and a tie. I was really blessed to be hooked up with him as I went to New York. He was, in fact, my mentor. And he was the man who also found me my very first job out of high school. So I went to work the week after I was 18 years of age. And at that point, this was a large corporation that had maybe 12, 14 factories throughout the United States. And I went to work in the executive offices at Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street on the 35th floor of this high-rise building. Now I want to I mentioned that because here's this little country boy from West Virginia coal mine, now at Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street, big time. And how do you deal with it? Well, it was a piece of cake. I had a good mentor. You know, I talked with him daily, and I recall one instance where I used a sentence and said something was a replica of this, and he was so shocked at my using the word replica. I'll never forget that. He was so proud. To me, well, it is what it is, but he was impressed. Well, at any rate, he worked with me very, very closely, and unfortunately, he too was killed in an automobile accident some maybe 2 years after he had mentored me. But at any rate, I went to work in this office, and in this 60-story building, I never saw another African-American employee throughout this building, or someone whom I would identify as an employee, that is, seeing them on an elevator regularly or going to lunch. And so I began to wonder, this is strange. Here I go from West Virginia to the promised land, so-called, for racial relationships, and there are no black people at all in here. So I know that out of approximately 65 employees in the company I worked for, I was the only black, except for a 3-month period when they hired a temporary black secretary. But other than that, it was an all-white environment for me. But that was okay. It didn't bother me. Now, taking a glimpse of the time period, this was also the time, the first year Jackie Robinson played in the major league. Now, you can put your calculators away. I'll tell you how old I am. I'm 88 years old, all right? So you don't have to do the subtraction or this. So, at any rate, working at this company, no one ever discussed or talked race or anything like that. I was accepted, obviously, as just another of the employees working in the mail room, photocopying, printing, handling mail, and those kinds of things. But I did get to wear a shirt and a tie to work. So, an unusual thing happened one day, out of the blue. I was delivering mail to the #1 vice president of this large corporation. So it was before his secretary had arrived. Usually you put the mail on her desk, and his desk was a little remote, a little behind it. But at any rate, I decided that, well, she's not here, so, and he waved for me to come on in, so I carried the mail into him, in his office. This man was on the telephone talking, apparently with one of his subordinates, and he was talking very aggressively, furiously, and so forth. And using a few words of profanity, and so in the short period that I was in his office, then in his rage he said to this guy, "There's a blank in the wood pile somewhere." Now, the blank was filled in by an N word.
Yeah.
I had never heard that term in my life before. Here I am dropping this mail off in this guy's office. I have never been so shattered up to that point. I was personally, I suspect I was shaking I didn't know what to do. It so unnerved me, it destroyed my whole day. That whole evening, I didn't rest. I couldn't tell my family. I was too embarrassed to tell them. So I spent that evening trying to figure out what to do. Here this guy is a major figure in a major corporation. So I decided I was going to work the next day. I'm going early and I'm going in his office. I did exactly that. I went into his office and he had his head down. He was reading papers, documents. And I said, "Mr. Cowan, I didn't appreciate what I heard you say yesterday." And he raised his head slightly and said, "What are you talking about?" And I repeated his sentence to him. He said, "Oh, I'm sorry." And he went back to reading and so forth. Well, strangely enough, I felt quite relieved. I'll be honest with you. The fact I had done all that I could do, I now felt whole. And as far as what his message was, he more or less said, "Get the hell out of my office, I'm busy." I understand that. But I really felt reassured after that. Now again, I was still about 19 years old at that point in time. So that was quite impressive. But I will say that the topic, the issue, or that relationship never surfaced again. I mean, I saw him from time to time. He spoke, I spoke, and life went on like that. Now, this office, actually I was what they would call in those days an office boy. There were 4 of us, and whoever the kid, we were all about the same age, but whoever was the head of that little cadre would be promoted into one of the regular departments. And it was my turn. I became head of that little male department unit. And lo and behold, the North Koreans moved into South Korea. and the office manager said, "Well, Carl, we really would like to promote you, but you're going to be drafted." And I said, "Well, I understand," which I did. And the thought of going in the Army actually had a little bright side to me, because I had never forgotten my ambition of wanting to go to college. Here is, if I go in the Army, come out in the Army, then I will be able to go to college, because the Korean War was really just an appendage to World War II. It was the last vestige of that. So, at any rate, I continued to work, and of course, knowing that I was going to be drafted, I had this ambition. Frank, forgive me for being the inadequate musician that I am, but I had this ambition. My friend Frank, as you know, was a career musician in an Army band. Well, that was my ambition, to play in an Army band. So I played a little mellophone instrument in high school, and it's the same fingering and reading as a trumpet. And so I found this school of music in New York that you could rent an instrument and go to school there, and it was really jazz musicians who were the faculty there. So I enrolled to get my lip in shape so I could audition to play in an Army band. And God is good. It worked. It worked. I went in, drafted in, was in basic training at Fort Dix, New Jersey, and our barracks was next door to this Army band. Now, here again, I want to bring up, this is funny how race works, enters into equation. Next door to our barracks was the 173rd Army Band. It was an all-black military band. The Fort Dix, New Jersey was the home post of the 9th Infantry Division. Now, the infantry division is about 18 to 20,000 men. So the 9th Infantry Division had a big band, and it was all white. Now, just to reach back a little taste in history, you might recall that in 1947, well, you won't recall it, I do. In 1947, President Truman signed legislative and executive order integrating the military service. Well, if you do it in 1947, World War II ended in 45, they are decreasing the military service, so in effect, one of the big aspects to me of the Korean War was that it integrated the military service. It was the first time that the U.S. military service was to be integrated. And when I went in, my basic training was with an integrated unit, racially integrated. But this band, I slipped away from my training unit one day and went over to talk with the band director, and he assured me that he could get me in the band. I auditioned for him, and he needed a French horn player. I had never played French horn. He said, "That's all right. You know," and the music parts in a marching band are the same with the French horn and the mellophone. So I was in this Army band, had a great time doing parades down Fifth Avenue in New York, and we were really these guys were top-notch musicians, although they were jazz musicians. But so my first experience here with regard to race is to point out that I got a taste of what some of the old critics have said, you know, racial discrimination and separation isn't all bad. You know, if blacks have equal this, equal that, then it's all bad. In that case, I'm confident that I would not have been competitive in that 9th Infantry Division band because they were a top-notch band. But I was needed in that 173rd Army band without any real competition. So the racial thing really worked for me in that instance. Got one on. So in the Army band, after 4 months or so in playing in the band, I was sent to Korea, and I was assigned to the 25th Infantry Division band in Korea. Arrived in that band, I played for 2 weeks. The Chinese had entered the war. They began a major push. They, in the Army, this is not news to guys who are veterans and so forth. You know that, particularly in the modern Army, whether you're a cook, musician, or whatever, you're still basically a soldier. And if they need you in combat units, they will get you, regardless of where you are. So they reached in the band, they grabbed 3 of us, and I was sent to a field artillery unit. And I recall the lieutenant colonel came back to pick the 3 of us up, put us in his Jeep, and I meekly said to him, "But sir, I've never even seen a field artillery gun," as I call this in to show you how in school I was. They don't call them guns, they call them pieces. But I'd never seen a field artillery gun. And he said, "That's all right, son, you'll learn." About that time, there was this giant explosion. It looked like it was a scenario from a play or something. That question was answered, and then bam, boom, it was. And he said, "That's all right, boy. Those are our guns going off." And so I said, "Well, okay, let me get accustomed to this." Okay, he delivered us, and I was assigned to gun battery, and when I went to this gun battery, there were 6 gun batteries, 6 guns to a battery. And at any rate, I was assigned to one of the guns, and in this, at that time, if we were not being shelled, we could sleep in tents on cots. But if we were being shelled regularly, we had to sleep on the ground or in the ground. So at that time, we were not being shelled. So when I was assigned to the gun, there were 12 guys to a gun section, and they would be in this one tent. So I remember going in there and throwing my stuff on a cot, and there was, by the way, that unit was just being integrated. I think there were about 6 blacks in all 3 of the gun batteries. That's 18 guns. So there were about 6 black guys. But I know that I was the only black guy in this gun section. So I went in and threw my stuff on the cot, and a guy picked up his stuff and went to the other side of the tent. And throughout that time, for about a month or so, he looked at me, I'd look at him. I found out his name was Catron. His last name was Catron. He was from Alabama. So I immediately recognized that, hey, this guy's got a problem with my presence. But he was a quiet kind of guy and didn't talk that much. And I shrugged it off more or less. But it was clear that we were not fans of each other. Since we were in that same gun battery, well, that's the way it is. So later on, the commander of the gun battery, who was from New York and knew that I was from New York, saw a chance to create a new job in the Fire Direction Center. Fire Direction Center is the guys who decide the numbers that the guns use to hit the target. So it's a lot of computation, it's mathematical and so forth. So he called me, the commander asked me, he said, well, how about I'd like for you to go into our Fire Direction Center, which is still right there with the gun. You're physically in the same area, but you are so well protected. You do sleep underground, but it's sandbags all around and big logs, and it would withstand an incoming mortar round, particularly. But at any rate, so he sent me back to the rear for 3 weeks of training, and it turned out that I was surprised myself, without any college at all, that I ended up with the highest score in that whole class back there. So when I returned to my gun section, he was so proud and that he called what we call the formation of the guys to announce to them that our guy went there and wrapped up the score for everybody. So I put him in the Fire Direction Center. So I was in the Fire Direction Center at that time. And it happened on Mother's Day, 1952. We were being shelled very hard. And the guys in the Fire Direction Center would call out the fire mission to the guns by using field phones. And so they knocked out our field phones. So I had to come out of that highly protected underground, say, to the outside. And I was standing out, calling out these numbers for the guns, aiming at people who were shooting at us. So, at any rate, there was artillery was exploding all around, and so one hit me. One hit about 6 feet from me, but it was a dud. It didn't go off. But right after that, another one landed not too far. It went off, and it slashed my thigh. Well, I didn't know what happened. It knocked me down, and I knew I was hit, so I took my hand and put it on my thigh and looked at it, and all this blood was in my hand. So and I couldn't get up. Well, would you believe that this guy, Catron from Alabama, left the gun, came over and put me on his shoulder, carried me back to where I could be placed in an ambulance and sent to the rear. So that again, he was a quiet guy. He didn't say anything then. But after about 2 months in the hospital in Japan, I was sent back to that same gun unit. As they say in the military service, we're going to give you a chance to win an oak leaf cluster to your Purple Heart. You got one, so we will give you a chance to win another. So, I went back, and quite honestly, I made clear efforts to establish a friendship, which we did. We weren't close buddies, as they say, but from that time on, we did recognize each other, and even to this day, I'm very grateful to him in the way he handled the whole thing. So there again was a racial experience that I thought that would be noteworthy here. Now, I would there were several other things that happened in my lifetime that I would like to tell you about, but maybe in another session. I do want to bring you up to the point that when I left the Army, I did go to Ohio University, had one significant racial incident there. My roommate and I, we were two black guys going into this bar, and this big white guy, about 6'6" or something like that, close to 300 pounds. My friend and I had ordered a drink, and it was only a small number of black students enrolled at Ohio University. So at any rate, this guy that evening in the bar said, he walks in and he sees us there, and he says out loud to the whole audience, "Look what we have here." And then he goes on to say, "I left Cleveland hoping not to have to be faced with this kind of thing." So my buddy and I sat there, we each had this drink, and we decided that, we're going to have to fight our way out of this place before this goes, because he gathered a crowd around him, sympathized. But it didn't happen. We didn't have to fight our way out. We paid our bill, we went home. But we went, bottom line on that story was that several of the black guys became so agitated when we went back to the dorm that they formed a little group and went up there. Fortunately, the guy was gone. Mm-hmm. And we knew who he was, and because he played football, and we had a couple of black guys that also played football, so he was easily identified. But the tragedy of this story is that the next day, my friend and I decided that we will report the incident to the dean of men. So we went to the dean of men, and essentially the bottom line on that was, the dean of men said, "You boys are lucky, because if any trouble had happened, I would have thrown you out of school." That was his judgment at that point, just that clear. But he readjusted a little bit by saying, you guys are really older guys, you're veterans. He said, the university has an apartment right up on campus here. And by the way, the university guaranteed housing for their black students because there were so few. Other students had to go for their own after the first year. But the university had housing. And at that point, he decided that we could have this apartment if we liked. So that was a good thing. 3 veterans, we got together, and we had an apartment, and that's how I finished the college thing. I went from that experience on to become very active in the civil rights movement. I had a couple incidents later on similar to those I mentioned to you in the past. But I think by 1960, I too had felt that, hey, this can't continue going on as it's going on. I joined CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. I did sit-ins in Baltimore because the city of Baltimore would not allow African Americans to eat in restaurants or stay in hotels. And so I went through all of that, and I had experiences in other units during my profession. But fortunately, I had a wonderful career with the federal government because all instances that were grievable ended up more favorable and with good results. I had an excellent career in the federal government. So the civil rights movement became quite meaningful, and what I do want to mention in closing is that I'm leaving, I had a picture that I wanted to show you. Well, anyway, I have 2 little Walker girl granddaughters, and Frances and I are extraordinarily proud of these 2 little girls. They are Californians, and I'm reminded that they are the Walkers of the 21st century. What I've told you is the Walker experience of the mid-20th century, And so we're looking forward, and if this country got all kinds of crises and things going, but I would really love to look down from heaven and hear their story when they are 88 years old. So, thanks much for coming by. And,
thank you so much for coming this morning, and I'm sure that you feel the same way that I do, that it is a complete honor to have been witness and listening to Mr. Walker's stories, and I know with confidence that it's something that every one of us will truly remember for the rest of our lives. So another huge thank you to Mr. Walker for his incredible gift that he has given us this morning. Thank you very much.